WXXI presents The Rochester I Know, a series of interviews with notable residents of Monroe County and contributors to this area's rich history. Your host is William Pierce.
Hello and welcome to The Rochester I Know. Our guest today is Alice Wood Wynd. Alice Wynd has been active in Rochester civic and international affairs as well as women's issues for over 50 years in Rochester. Alice is a long-standing member of our own Board of Trustees here at WXXI, the board being known as the Rochester Area Educational Television Association. Alice, it's a distinct pleasure for me to have you here today as our guest. Alice, you've been engaged in so many civic and community affairs in the city of Rochester and the county of Monroe over the past 50 years. I know since the early 20s that it would take days to discuss all of your activities, but I would like you to briefly tell us something about where you were born, where you grew up, and something about your early childhood here in Rochester.
Bill, thank you for asking me. You're too gracious in what you say. I was born on Rutgers Street in 1904. Then in 1907, my father built our house in what was then country. It's that red brick house which is still standing opposite Maplewood on East Avenue.
The restaurant.
Yes, the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And the Basilian Fathers own it now and live in it. It was real country then, just farmland. And my brother and I went to Allen's Creek School, which was a two-room schoolhouse located where the present school is, with Miss Stroger teaching the first 4 grades and Miss Gardner teaching the next 4, the last 4. My family decided that around the 5th grade, we really ought to go into Rochester for our education. So we took the Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern, which was the big electric interurban trolley, at stop 7, which is right at Maplewood. Now that trolley ran where 490 is now. And that stop was a good place to get on the on the car. But I must say, at the last bit, it was uphill. And if my brother and I were late and running all the way, that hill was really hard. We came into Francis Parker School number 23 on Barrington Street for 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, and then into East High School on Alexander Street for our high school experience.
That's the East High School where this Channel 21 started.
I often reminded you of that fact. It was old home territory to me.
As a matter of fact, our studio was in the gymnasium, and I presume you used to play basketball.
I did, indeed. That's true.
In that gym.
Yeah.
An awful lot of folks in this community went to what we still call Old East High.
Either West or East, that was all.
Those were the only 2 high schools in town at the time.
And of course, my mother had gone to the one Rochester Free Academy, which is the one preserved on Fitcher Street, and the only high school of its in Rochester in her day.
The landmark, which was the former Board of Education building and is now offices and houses a restaurant.
That's right. She went there.
And where did she live when she went to?
On Troop Street.
In the 3rd Ward.
That's right.
So she could walk over to Fitcher Street.
I really realized the other day why all those churches were built on Church Street is because people in the most of the people in those days lived in the 3rd Ward, and they could all walk to church on Sunday for the morning service and Sunday evening service, and for Wednesday evening service. They didn't have to get out the horse and buggy.
It's amazing. Now,
and of course, that's why the City Hall was built there, and the county office building, and all the rest of it.
Everything was within walking distance then.
Yes.
And Pittsford was then farmland, I guess, as was Brighton. What was Brighton like when you were growing up?
When you went out Monroe Avenue, at Highland Avenue, the city stopped, and there were just fields. And on the right-hand side where Homemakers is now, I remember very clearly the 3 brick-making kilns that were in those fields.
And beyond that, farmland.
Yes, that's all.
That's amazing. Alice, I know that during your career, you were a reporter for the Democrat and Chronicle on a couple of occasions, different assignments. You covered civic issues, local industry. I know you covered women's issues. You were active in the RAUN, Rochester Association for United Nations. You did an awful lot of work during both wars, World War I and World War II, in the community. Well, it just goes on, but is there an event that jumps out at you in all the 50 years that you've been so involved in the life of this community?
Of course, Bill, if you live long enough, you get involved in a lot of things. And it sounds as if
I think
it
you
was
got
too
involved
many.
by design. I think you were that kind of person. You sought it out.
Well, I did enjoy it, I must say. It was a wonderful opportunity. I've loved my life in Rochester, and it's been a very interesting and wonderful life. I think I do want to start with 1920, if I may.
Please.
Because that is to me, a very emotional and very memorable campaign between Warren Gamaliel Harding and James G. Cox over the League of Nations issue. And because my family was so very deeply involved imaginatively in the suffering of the First World War, my father believed very strongly that some good must come out of it. And the best good that he could see was some sort of League of Nations. And so he did stand for the League of Nations. And that was an unpopular cause in Rochester. So it took a lot of courage and was hard. He and Dexter Perkins and Frank Gannett were the 3 leading citizens, as I remember it, who were for the League.
Now, this is your dad, Dexter Perkins, who
was chairman of the History Department
at the University of Rochester, and Frank Gannett, who started the Gannett Papers.
That's right. The reason I bring it up is because I wanted to talk a little bit about what Convention Hall means to me. That is where all the meetings in Rochester were held in the early days. That was our one big meeting place. Before the First World War, that's where I heard Schumann Heink. That's where I heard the great Polish pianist Paderewski. That's where Herman Dosenbach conducted his orchestra. This is long before the Eastman School, you see. And that's where the big political meetings were held. And that's where Warren Gamaliel Harding made his big campaign speech in Rochester. I remember Florence Kling Harding just as well as if it were yesterday. And James G. Cox. And
there.
of
Now,
course,
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running with
he
Cox.
was running for the vice presidency on the Democratic ticket, and that's when he stayed at our house. Famous.
Goes a little further than that. Franklin, FDR, indeed, spent the night in your bedroom and in your bed, as
That's
I recall.
true.
And you were, what, a high school student at the time?
Oh, yes. But
But you gave up your bedroom for that
Yes, I
evening.
did. But I hope that they put a plaque by that door because, you know, another 100 years, somebody will be happy to know that Franklin Roosevelt stayed there.
FDR slept
Yes.
here, one of those. But getting back to
Convention
Convention Hall. Now, Convention Hall is what I came to know as the Naval Armory,
That's right.
and now the Jiva Theater
That's
is
right.
starting
That's right.
to take that over. So that building is still there.
But you see, that's right. But it has a very precious place in my heart because that's where the big conventions were held, where the big musical events were held before the Eastman School was built. And then during the Depression, that's where the city public assistance office was. And it was just jammed with people, desperate people needing help. Now my husband reminds me that in the later it became the place where all the wrestling matches were. And he reminds me that Mark Ellingson, the former president of Rochester Institute of Technology, was a wrestler in college and used to work out with these famous wrestlers before they came.
When they would come to town, Mark
Yes,
Ellingson would
yes.
would
Give
work
them,
them
a little,
over or give them some...
well, to give them a little practice before the main event.
This is when wrestling was real, I imagine.
Oh yes, when wrestling was real. And then later, when we were going, this is just before the Second World War, when Rochester was going through the agonizing decision as to whether or not we in this city would help England, or whether we wanted to be isolationist and felt that Hitler was going to win anyway. The big meetings were held in Convention Hall in which the people talked and discussed these big issues. Now, of what's happened there since, I don't know, but it was an important place in Rochester at one time.
It may still be an important place as Jiva turns it into a
It could be.
theater and
It could be
maybe
indeed.
a restaurant.
I hope so.
It's had an amazing history.
I hope so. Then there was another place which was a real meeting place in Rochester. That was the main dining room of the Powers Hotel, because that's where the City Club held their Saturday noon meetings. You have to remember, we had about radio, we had our first crystal set, I think, in 1920. Is that about right? You think that would be about right?
That's about right.
And radio began really in the late 20s.
1927 was the Federal
Yes,
Radio Act, the
yes.
first attempt to begin
Yeah.
regulating radio.
But you couldn't, of course, television didn't come until after the Second World War. So it was very important to have important, knowledgeable people in all sorts of fields of activity come to speak in Rochester. And they came to speak on Saturday noon in the Powers Hotel at the Men's City Club. And the men all were on the ground floor eating their luncheon, but ladies were allowed to come to the balcony, although they couldn't ask questions. These were very interesting meetings. And of course, when I came back from college, first I worked on the Democrat and as a cub reporter, and then I ran the Woman's Page, which was supposed to really concentrate on what the great women's organizations in Rochester were doing, and they were very important. Wonderful organizations. Then I went to the Times-Union, and dear Al Siegel, who was a city editor, gave me a job, and that's when I had the civic and industrial beat and did a lot of special articles on government. And that's also when the county park system was started, and George Y. Webster, an attorney for the county, was really responsible, I think, for that.
Now, we're talking late 1920s at this point.
Yes. I wrote the stories about the acquisition by the county of Ellison Park, of Mendon Ponds Park, and of Powder Mill Park. And I'm always so happy it was done, because they're marvelous parks and wonderfully used.
And it could never happen today.
I'm afraid not. And I always long so much to have them properly maintained, because they are enormously used.
That's true.
Yeah.
What other events or places during the course of your civic activities stand out in your mind besides the Powers Hotel and Convention Hall?
Let me go back to the Powers Hotel for a minute, because you asked me the other day, and I wasn't quick enough, what happened to City Club? What happened was that Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president in March of 1933, and the first big thing he did was to establish the National Recovery Administration under Hugh Johnson.
The so-called NRA.
Yes, NRA, and we had big parades on Main Street and everything, and that was supposed to encourage people, bring back their self-confidence. You remember Franklin Roosevelt, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And so part of this was to arouse people's self-confidence. But also, one of the things it did was it stopped people working Saturday morning.
Ah.
You see?
And
1934.
City Club was noon
and noon on Saturday.
So he shortened the work
So the normal thing was for people to work on Saturday, go to City Club and go home. Now, when you no longer worked on Saturday, you were doing something else, and you'd have to go downtown to the meetings. So
we no longer have that remarkable lineup of outstanding speakers.
Outstanding people.
Week in
and
week out.
They really had wonderful discussions. And then, of course, television came along after the Second World War, and that made it really no longer necessary. You saw all the famous people on television.
But you never had a chance to meet them in person.
No.
Unless we invite them on.
That's right.
Like this.
Yeah.
What other place? I know you were instrumental in starting so many organizations, or you were in on the ground floor as different commissions or agencies got underway in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. You worked with a social welfare agency during the Depression years in the 30s. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and what your role was.
I was appointed to the State Board of Social Welfare in May of 1937 by Governor Lehman. And as a result, I did work very closely not only at the state level and at the national level, but I worked very closely with the Rochester people, helping in the very awful depression that we were in. Now, I particularly remember, of course, as you know, let me go back to 1934, 32, Mayor Stanton was elected mayor of the city of Rochester, and he was the first Democrat I guess we'd had since the Civil War. At least I think that's true. Came in on Franklin Roosevelt's coattails. But Frank X. Kelly was then Commissioner of Welfare. And then when the Republicans gained City Hall, Emmett Gahn was Commissioner of Welfare. They were, both of them, excellent commissioners. And the person who was the woman who was just outstanding was Catherine Manning. She was chief case supervisor for many, many years, and a nationally known figure. Catherine Vandekar now was the chief case supervisor at the county level, and Jess Hannon, who had been supervisor of the town of Parrington, was commissioner of welfare at the county. And then after the war, you see the city and the county amalgamated, and Jess became the commissioner for the whole thing. Jess, incidentally, of course, I worked closely with all these men and admired them very much. And Jess, incidentally, is the father of Mrs. Robert Antell, who is very active in the community today.
Alice, the city manager form of government had an early start here, I believe in the 20s, and that came about for very good reasons. I wonder if you could tell us how that came about and what impact it had.
It's one of the first things that I worked on when I came back from college in 1925. The Women's City Club was extremely active. It had a big building there on Chestnut Street behind the Regent Theater. And the women in the Women's City Club had been very instrumental in the suffrage movement and in passing the suffrage amendment in 1920. So it was very wonderful for me to work with those women. One of the presidents of the club, incidentally, was Alice Peck Curtis, who was the mother of General Edward Peck Curtis. Now, the reason I mention this is that they worked very hard with a lot of other organizations for the city manager plan. It was proposed by the Bureau of Municipal Research, and as you know, George Eastman had supported and helped the Bureau of Municipal Research.
Yeah. I believe that organization is still there today. It's called the Center for Governmental Research. It's in the Jonathan Child building across from the Board of Education building.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right. they had suggested that the city manager plan would be a good one for Rochester to take politics out of the administration of the city. They said, you know, there isn't a Republican way or a Democratic way of building streets or sewers or collecting garbage. There's just one good way, and it should be done on a business basis. We all worked very hard for that plan, and I think Mr. Eastman provided the money to bring Emily Newbuell here, who was the head of the organization. And of course, we did, without television, we did have radio, but without television, the main thing that we depended on was newspapers, some radio, and then going around and just pushing doorbells or putting advertisements in the streetcars. Any way that we could think up to get people interested in the city manager form of government. Now, as I remember it, I may be wrong about this, but I think that Louis S. Folks was chairman of that effort. Now, he is the father of Helen Folks Sykes, Mrs. Wadsworth Sykes. And he was a member of the first city council. And another one whom I remember very well is Isaac Adler, who is the father of Jane Adler Goldman. And Manuel Goldman has made a very wonderful contribution to the city of Rochester and is, of course, the older brother of Judge Harry Goldman. Manny died, unfortunately, last month. But they were the leading figures in the early city manager form of government, and I'm sorry that people are talking about going back to the other system.
Going back to strong mayor.
Yes.
Now, you worked with the county and city managers over the years on many of your projects. Does any one of them stand out in your mind as someone who was particularly cooperative or enlightened in the management of this city or county?
Well, both Steve Story, who was the first city manager, and Harold Baker, who was the second, and he was city manager much longer, were excellent. And then, of course, when I was working for the League of Women Voters, with the League of Women Voters, in the 30s, the early 30s, I had quite a bit to do with he was later county manager, Clarence Smith, and formed a very high regard for him. I gave a lot of speeches on what was going on.
He was the father of Craig Smith, who
right.
recently headed the Center for Governmental Research.
That's right.
I
That's
believe.
right.
Yeah. Alice, you had many statewide positions, which we'll never get into, and I know you served in Europe briefly, I think, and reported to the local papers. But wherever you went, I recall you saying several times, you always had a feeling that Rochester was somehow different than other communities, or more progressive, or more cohesive, or what quality would you assign to the city of Rochester that you didn't see in other cities? Because you often represented this city in concert with other cities.
That's true, and I do feel that Rochester is unusual. I came back to Rochester being sorry that my responsibility was to come back here and thinking that I was going to miss all the action. I'm so glad I did come back. I sat on when I was on the State Board of Social Welfare. I sat on 2 commissions which had hearings throughout the state. And if you go through these series of hearings, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, Westchester County, maybe Binghamton, New York City, you realize that Rochester has a most unusual sense of cooperation and of civic duty. None of the other cities had the cohesiveness, had the ability to work together, had the desire to work together that Rochester has. And there's a real sense of civic responsibility in Rochester, which was tremendous and most unusual. I found later, of course, in talking with state officials, that it was well known. And then in talking with national officials, they told me, well, New York State is outstanding, and of New York State, Rochester is the outstanding community. Now, you and I have seen this in Channel 21, Bill. We know that we have absolutely marvelous membership support, help, volunteers, and that our programming is particularly geared to the very sophisticated needs of Rochester, which wants the very best in the arts and in music and in public affairs. As you know, I belong to 3 different public television stations, and there's no doubt that Rochester has the best programming.
I want everybody watching to know this is an unsolicited testimonial. We didn't expect. Now, one brief final question. Why is this so about Rochester? Why?
Well, I think there are 2 reasons I suggested earlier. I think one reason is that we have a very highly skilled labor force here and a high technology industry here. Bausch & Lomb, Todd Company, Kodak, Cybron, Taylor, all the others brought very highly educated people here. But also we had all the skilled trades here. We had very good leadership. The Sibleys, Harper and Georgie Sibley, many others that I should mention, gave us leadership of real community.
Leadership is it. Alice Wood-Wynd, thank you very much for being our guest today. This has indeed been a pleasure for me, and thank you for being with us today. Join us next time on the Rochester I Know.